Penny, a brawler that for the longest time was ignored by the dev team and adored by the community. Back in 2020, she became the first brawler to not receive a balance change for an entire year. This, coupled with her increasing mediocrity in every mode, made players push for a Penny rework. She would finally receive one 2 years later, in June of 2022. But this rework ended up turning part of the community against her, as she would become by far the best brawler in the game. Penny, at her peak, was a brawler who had few clear weaknesses, as she could handle aggro amazingly with her burst damage from her gadget. Remember, this was also during a time before the damage buffs to snipers like Nani, Piper, and Mandy. So she also had decent enough HP to move in closer to longer-ranged opponents. And if she could build up her super, in many cases, the opponents would be spawn-trapped. This gets into another thing that has always made Penny broken: her cannon. Although it rarely hits its shots, the lingering fire from the cannonballs meant that she had great area control, as each ball would keep its fire area for 3 seconds and was shot out every 2.5 seconds. This meant Penny had a 100% uptime on her area control, and the only way to stop it was to make it past the brawler that could melt you if you got too close. This also meant you were giving her more supercharge for another cannon if you got hit. Because of all this, players were forced to try and ignore her cannon until they could take out the other brawlers on the team. So her cannon essentially became a permanent fourth member of Penny's team that would throw fire from halfway across the map. So at her peak, we see that Penny was a brawler with above-average HP for her class. That had a super, which basically made her two brawlers. One that could melt any opponents that got too close, and one with great area control that can be thrown from behind walls. And trying to defeat her super a lot of times meant you fed her another one. I wonder if that reminds you of any other brawler which has been dominating the game recently. But after several nerfs to Penny's HP, super, and gadget, she is back to where she was before her rework, a bottom 15 brawler in the game. A lot of people might say this is deserved, as she had her year to shine and was toxic in the meta. But I think it's important for a brawler like her to be at least decent in game. What these people don't see is the fact that Penny is one of the first brawlers a newer player will have in the game. This is because she is one of the options for newer players to get for free through the starting daily logins. And this is even more influential, as these players will get a skin, gadget, and star power for her. And the game will even power her up to level 9 for them. This means that for a lot of new players, Penny will be their first introduction into gadgets, gears, and star powers, and likely will be their first introduction to hypercharges when she receives one. If we want newer players to stick around and not feel at a disadvantage in the game, I feel it is important that brawlers that they will most likely invest in early be at least decent in game or fulfill a unique role. So before we get into my concept for a Penny rework, I will state my two methods behind these changes. Firstly, I don't want to make any part of her kit too complex. She is only a super rare brawler, and off the early brawlers you get, she is already one of the most complex, with newer player not understanding how things like her super or salty barrel work. You might think I'm exaggerating, but I couldn't tell you the amount of times I have seen players treat her super like a Jessie turret at lower levels. Second, I am reworking her to be a niche pick and not exactly a top meta brawler. I think we have all seen before through the previous Penny meta and the current L and L1 that brawlers like these just should not be the best in the game. But now that all of that is out of the way, I think we should take a look at Penny's current stats to start off this rework. Also, for this section, when using Penny's old stats, I will be plugging them into the current 10% power system for an equivalent comparison. When comparing Penny's current stats to what they were when she was broken, we see that over several nerfs she has lost a total of 1200 HP. This is almost a 16% HP nerf. This, added with several damage buffs to other brawlers, has unfortunately caused her to have a lot more losing matchups in the game. Her main attack split shot was also decreased from 100% of her base damage down to 75%. This, coupled with her salty barrel HP nerf from 2666 to 2240, made her much more susceptible to aggro picks. It isn't all a nerf for her main attack though, as she got a 80 damage buff from 1880 to now 1960. But her split shot still got overall nerfed from 1880 to 1470. Onto her super, we see that her 100% uptime was eliminated as the fire rate of Old Lobber was nerfed to 3.5s. And finally, her Master Blaster Star power got a slight buff to 1372 from 1333. You might also consider her access to the pet power gear a slight buff. But seeing as her cannon rarely hits opponents, I feel it was only a buff in modes like Heist and maybe Hot Zone. Now, when looking over her entire kit, we see a pretty common trend in that she was met with multiple nerfs to her survivability, while other brothers were met with buffs to their damage. I know I compared Penny to Larry and Lori earlier, but two key differences between them is that L and L have a heal, and the second brawler for Larry tries to dodge shots. This means that Penny overall has less survivability than her counterparts, but if we simply try to buff it back up, we could end up with another L and L. So instead, the buffs I propose will be more geared towards giving Penny a new niche. And the two niches that I decided on is to be a counter to spawner brawlers, and to be an area-controlled damage dealer hybrid. To do this, the first change I propose is another slight damage buff from 1960 to 2040. Just like her previous buff, this is only a 80 damage buff. But unlike the other one, this would change a ton of interactions with her. I have listed all of them on the screen. But some of the important ones that I would like to mention is her ability to now 3-shot 6k HP brawlers. This includes brawlers like Jesse, Angelo, Larry, and Miko, and 4-shot the 8k HP brawlers like Nita. Next on to her HP. For both her and her turret, I have made adjustments based on another spawner brawler who is currently great in the meta, Jesse. Penny has always had a history of being balanced similarly to Jesse, especially in the early days of Brawl. So I would like to make changes based around Jesse and her turret. Jesse currently has 6,000 HP, while Scrappy has 6,600. Her turret is slightly more tanky than her, as she often throws it in front of her to protect her or lock down an area. This is inverse for Penny, as she often protects her cannon. So I would simply inverse these stats by buffing Penny's HP from 6,400 to 6,600, and buffing Old Lobber's HP from 5,600 to 6,000. This adds a bit more survivability to both Penny and her cannon. And in Penny's case, this buff falls in between her most recent nerf, which took her health down from 6,800 to 6,400. Just like with her damage buff, I have put up a list of all the major interactions this would change. Finally, for her base stats, I would just like to change up her cannon and fire damage numbers a bit. Currently, her cannonball does 2,400 damage and leaves a fire circle that does 528 damage every second, for 3 seconds. This totals up to 39984 damage. My change is only a slight buff, with her initial damage being increased to 2,500, while her fire damage is decreased to 500 damage. This comes out to 4,000 total damage, or 4,800 if you are using the pet gear. This is a very minuscule change that was done for more clarity in her numbers for newer players, and for the balancing of my hypercharge concept for her, which I will mention later on. But for now, on to her gadgets and star powers. For her gadgets, even though I feel that Salty Barrel is the better one, both are actually helpful in some ways. They are also way better than her previous 2 gadgets. I do not want to change Salty Barrel that much, as it could potentially make Penny broken again, and Trusty Spyglass has its niche uses in more passive modes and 5v5, so I actually would not propose any changes for her gadgets, but for her star powers I'm actually completely changing one. And that star power is Heavy Coffers. Heavy Coffers is completely toxic at lower levels of play, as people will just run into the split shots, while seeing almost no play at upper levels ever since the nerf to Penny's split shots. I don't hate the idea of getting more value out of her unique mechanic, however. So rather than being a star power, I have nerfed its effect a bit and changed it up to be a mythic gear instead. The heavy coffers gear will only provide an additional singular shot instead of 2, but in turn will also boost her split damage to 85% instead of 75%. With the damage buff, I propose this would take her split damage from 1530 to 1734. Just like my previous mythic gear ideas, I wanted to make this gear situational. And since you only get the damage buff on the split shots, I feel this gear would mostly be used against spawners, or in tandem with the damage gear for a damage dealer Penny build. But back to her star powers, what used it to be? The Heavy Coffer star power is now the Plunderer star power. Spawned units and turrets now charge her super, but only half as effectively. This also only applies to her main shot and not her split shots or super. This change would help out Penny even more in her role of being a counter to spawners, but is useless against brawlers without pets or turrets. The role behind this star power is to be one predominantly found in draft to punish opponents for early spawner picks, while also punishing opponents dumb enough to use a pet gadget like Taraz or Charlie's against Penny. Again, to help balance it out, this would only charge her super half as effectively as brawlers would. So if you were only hitting spawned units, it would take 10 shots to charge up her super. This star power also only applies to summoned units or turrets, so it is not effective on the heist safe, but is effective on totems like Leon's Lollipop or Stu's Speed Area. Now finally on to my concept for Penny's hypercharge. Since Penny's turret is hard to take out, I wanted her hypercharge to be a temporary buff unlike Jessie's. So my concept is the overclock hypercharge. For 5 seconds, Penny's turret will shoot at fast but slowly decreasing rate until it cools back down to normal. I have down a chart of how fast each shot would come out in a perfect situation, where there is a target to shoot at for the whole 5 seconds. As you see, this hyper would send out a ton of shots early, before gradually making its way back down to regular. This was done as this would be a harder to get hypercharge similar to Crow's, where in most matches, you would probably only get 1 per game. So to balance it out, I wanted to make it get guaranteed value if it happens to be destroyed early. As mentioned before, I also balanced Penny's cannon damage around this hypercharge because I wanted to take into account the heist safe. Unlike Penny, Old Lobber does not get any damage buffs from hypercharge. And in an ideal situation where all 8 cannonballs hit the turret, it would do a total of 32,000 damage, or 38,400 damage with the let gear. These numbers are 40% and 48% of the heist safe respectively. I feel like this is a fair amount of damage, as another hypercharged brawler, Colette, can deal 25% of the heist safe with a faster charging hypercharge, and Crow, who will have a similarly charging hypercharge, does 44% of the safe. But after all these changes, I feel like Penny would have 4 main builds that could be used based on which brawler she is facing or which mode she is in. Her first build is an all-arounder build that would give Penny a lot more defenses, with both the Salty Barrel gadget and Master Blaster star power. This would be her most consistent build for ladder. Second, I have her area control build. This would be a build for her in more passive modes that would allow her to push opponents back after she builds up her super. Third, we have her anti-spawner build, with both her new star power and mythic gear brawlers who usually hide behind their supers would now have to avoid pushing up. It forces them to play a game around having to defeat Penny before they can use their supers. And finally, we have Penny's heist build. I only think it is appropriate that a pirate brawler would be a menace in heist, and this build is made all around that. If she can build up hypercharge, she would be able to do massive damage to the heist with the pet gear. And she uses her Plunderer star power here to help build it up if she is facing other common heist brawlers, such as Jessie, 8-Bit, Nita, and Charlie. But that is about all I have for today's video. Thank you guys so much again for all the support and love on my rework ideas. And if you enjoy them, I hope you subscribe and tell me your ideas for the balancing of the brawlers. Thank you guys for watching.